Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron. We declare the game's Odyssey open.
Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from Olympia to now. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton.
And today have we got an episode. It's got everything you could possibly want, Sarah. Secret war societies, revolution, British grandmas, and epic mustaches. What more could you possibly want?
I don't know.
Seriously.
I don't know. It really is everything. Maybe we want the Olympics.
It's the whole package. And we're going to get up to there for sure. Because today we're going to be talking specifically about how the Olympic Games were revived. This is one of those topics where I feel like it gets skipped over a lot. People tend to talk about 1896 and they talk about Baron de Coubertin and his vision to bring the Olympics back. And it's just kind of like this footnote to the actual Olympic movement, but the story behind that is a lot more interesting. And the fact that Baron de Coubertin, he was not the only one involved in that process. He definitely deserves a lot of credit, but he was not the only person who helped bring them back. It's kind of like assuming that Neil Armstrong got to the moon by himself, you know?
Right.
But yeah, so Sarah, let's I guess kind of prep people for what they're going to hear in the episode. What are the highlights?
All right. Well, the 1800s saw a revived interest in ancient Greek culture and the Greek Revolution. Influential Greeks were looking for ways to help their new nation gain respect and influence. So these were old school influencers, maybe? I wonder if they had their affiliate codes and whatnot for all their friends. Next, the idea of the Olympics had continued in regional athletic competitions, especially in Britain. So Britain's in the picture. And then the man of the hour, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who sounds like a villain from a spy movie, was ultimately at the center of the effort to resurrect the Olympic Games, much like the resurrection of Pelops. The 1896 Olympic Games in Athens were a direct result of his efforts, setting into motion not only the modern Olympic and Paralympic Games, but international athletic competitions in general.
Let's talk a little bit more about what was happening in the 1800s, because it turns out it was quite a lot. During the 1800s, you saw the US and you saw Western Europe in particular really having this revived interest in ancient cultures. They really gravitated towards Greek antiquity, the classic model of education, the Socratic method of teaching, critical thinking. All of these things started to kind of find their way into the educational system as well. So let me ask you this. Did people forget about the Olympics before this revived interest? What do you think?
I'm sure some people did, but overall, the idea of the Olympics, it never completely died out. Olympic societies were actually formed around the British Isles, and athletic clubs became popular in Europe and the United States as offshoots of gentlemen's clubs. So, there we are on the sidelines, we as in females. Regardless, the history of sports kept pointing back to one place, and that place, of course, was Greece.
Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Greece, but not the one with John Travolta, okay?
Oh, but I love that movie.
The way that my wife knew I was really interested in her when we started dating was, I think, our third or fourth date. I took her to go see Grease because it was playing at a local theater. They were doing some sort of retro movie night. I had never seen it, so she knew the fact that I was willing to sit through that with her that early on in our relationship, that there had to be something special there. So
good on ya. Good job.
So let's talk about the country of Greece. What was going on?
After the Roman Empire was split into two halves, so the East and the West, the region of
Hmm.
Greece became part of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, as you might have heard.
I'm not an expert on it by any any means, but I have heard of it.
Yeah, it was kind of a big deal. During the 15th century, Greece had fallen under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which has shockingly little to do with furniture. Over the next few centuries, there were a number of sporadic but unsuccessful attempts at revolution.
It's interesting because even though the Greeks have been around as a people for a long time, I guess they never really had their own country, right? Because ancient Greece was a bunch of city states.
Mhm.
They weren't really unified as a country unless they were fighting against the Persians, and then they belonged to these other empires for a long time. So that kind of does get us up to the 1800s, where in 1814 there was this society, this secret Greek organization formed called Philiki Eteria. And that meant the friendly brotherhood. Doesn't that sound so wholesome to you?
It does sound wholesome. Was it
Yeah,
wholesome, though?
it just sounds like a bunch of guys getting together to hug, I
Yeah.
guess.
The friendly brotherhood,
But that
mind you, not the sisterhood.
yeah, the friendly brotherhood. There were no sisters in this organization, but yeah, their organization wasn't quite as warm and fluffy as maybe the translation sounds. Their plan really was to start launching revolts, first through the Peloponnese region, and also they were going to stir up some trouble in the Ottoman capital of Constantinople itself. So they were just strategically thinking of how can we coordinate these revolts because our other efforts at revolution have not been successful. So let's really get a plan in place here. Now, there's a good side to that, right? You want to be organized if you're going to be revolting against an empire. But on the flip side of that, the more you plan, the easier it is for information to leak out. And that ended up being what happened. Their plans were discovered by the Ottoman Empire, and so they just decided to move up the date and start the revolution anyway. They were like, "Oh man, guys, we got found out. Can we just do it this week instead?" And they said, "Yeah, let's do it."
Move it up. See if we catch him by surprise.
It seems to have worked in their favor because the Greek Revolution officially started in 1821, when revolutionaries in the southern section of the Peloponnese, they were the first ones to declare war and really make it official. Finally, in 1829, Russia invaded the Ottoman Empire and made things difficult for the Ottoman Empire, where they had to start recognizing some of these breakaway cells as independent nations. So in 1832, that was really when the borders of Greece, the new Greece, I should say, were defined, and that's also when some treaties established Prince Otto of Bavaria as the first king of a unified Greece. So that's a lot, but
But it's really interesting because I'm sitting here thinking about the time period that this was going on
mhm.
in the first half of the 1800s, and it was just a short time after the French Revolution and the American Revolution,
Mhm.
and just the amount of world history that would change the course of history forever when it comes to government and rule and countries and all these things. Just really interesting.
But yeah, we have the birth of Greece, and they decided they wanted, at least at that time, they wanted to be a monarchy, so they've got a king.
Around this time, Panayotis Zoutsos he was a Greek young poet and newspaper publisher, and he called for a revival of the Greek Olympics. So here we are, we're bringing the Olympics into the scene. While it would take 20 years for the idea to catch on, he did feel that the games would help Greece regain prominence, and he wrote, if Greece could reestablish the Olympic Games the peoples of the world would respect us. That's a pretty big quote there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, that's a bold statement to say that for him at least, the Olympic Games of ancient Greece really, I guess, showed the best of Grecian culture. It was still held in that high esteem after, however many thousands years it had been gone. And that kind of gets us up to the next important Greek guy that we need to talk about, which is Evangelus Zappos, who I'd never heard of him. Honestly, I'd never heard of any of these people before digging into it. But this guy named Evangelus Zappos, he was a wealthy shipping magnate, and he was a war hero from the Greek Revolution. But he was really inspired by those words from Zoutsos to put his fortune behind reviving the games there in Greece. So again, this is not a story that you hear talked a lot about. And I don't think the Greeks get enough credit for not just creating the Olympic Games in the first place, but bringing them back, that they were very actively engaged in wanting them to come back. So Evangelus, we'll talk about him a little bit because he's an interesting character. So he was born in Albania, there in the Balkans. He left home at the age of 13 years old. And like most 13-year-olds want to do, he enrolled to become a mercenary in the Ottoman militia. So I'm not quite sure what to do with that.
Yeah, was this common or was he a unique situation?
I think he was a unique situation, but obviously he got disenfranchised. Or that's not the word I'm looking for. What's the word I'm looking for? It's not disenfranchised.
Disenchanted.
There we go. That's it. Disenchanted. He got disenchanted with that because he was a member of the Philiki Eteria. So he saw enough of what the Ottomans were doing to say, yeah, I don't want to keep getting paid to do this. And because of his Greek heritage, wanting to see Greece become an independent nation. So he rose throughout the revolution. He ended up rising to the rank of major. So, you could say he had a major influence, I suppose.
I see what you did
We
there.
love a good pun.
We do.
Yeah. In 1831, then he immigrated to Romania, and that's where he really got into land and agriculture investment, and that's where his wealth ended up coming from. So he became one of the wealthiest men in Eastern Europe at that time. So 1831, if you remember, we were just talking about, that's when the borders of Greece were being established. That's when King Otto was established on the throne. So kind of perfect timing if you want to have some people making an influence and to have some money. He was definitely the guy to know as a king. So in 1856, so fast forwarding a quarter of a century, he actually wrote to King Otto and said, hey, I want to fund a revival of the Olympic Games in Athens. So as a young nation with an ancient history, he felt like this was a patriotic duty to the nation to help revive the country to its former glory. And again, inspired by Zeuxos's words, he felt like the Olympic Games were going to be central to that effort. And apparently it worked because the king said, yeah, this is a great idea. Go for it. You've got my support. And with that blessing, he provided the Greek government with the financial resources they needed to establish the Olympic Trust Fund. Now, that same year, 1856, in July of that year, we're going to come back to our friend Panayotis Zoutsos. So by this time, he was really established as a power in the press, and so he used that power to make Zappos's proposal widely known throughout the country. Again, they're kind of working together here. You got the royal support, you got the financial support, and now you've got to get public opinion behind it. So yeah, Zoutsos are putting out in all of his newspapers how they needed to bring back the Olympics, how this was really important for the country, and it worked. So now you had the public saying, yeah, this would be a great idea. So they did bring back the Olympic Games on a local level there in Greece. Those revived games were simply just known as Olympics. Today, they're referred to as the Zappeian Olympiads because of Zappos' influence.
That's pretty cool. He got like Olympic Games named after him. That's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, they're not considered official Olympiads, of course, in
Right.
terms of the modern movement, but, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the modern movement would not have happened without this happening first. So those Olympiads were kind of scattered. They were not held every 4 years like the ideal would have been. They were held in 1859, 1870, 1875, and then in 1888. So there were four of them kind of leading the way. The sports that they featured included javelin, discus, pole climbing. Um, yeah, I don't quite know what that is, but I guess it was a popular sport back then. um, Wrestling, jumping, and stone throwing, which I guess is similar to shot put, but I guess they just threw boulders. I don't know.
I don't know. Sign me up. I want to watch.
They also attempted to have a chariot race in one of those Olympiads. And, well, there's a reason it didn't happen after one attempt because four of the six chariots crashed on the course.
No surprise.
Yeah, it's not a surprise. So that's why we've moved on to other type of equestrian events, and we don't have the chariot race to this day. But good effort, guys. I mean, they were trying to do the thing. And then in 1859, so that first Zappeian Olympiad, that event, because they didn't have a venue ready yet, they just held it in a city square there in Athens. So I don't know how super organized it was, if they sold tickets or if people really knew it was happening ahead of time. But I guess if you wanted to see it, you just went to the city square and you watched people compete.
Do you know if the winners were awarded anything?
I did not find anything on that. I would like to assume that they did the wreaths because they were trying to emulate so much from ancient history, but I didn't see anything specifically about what the victors were given. I don't even know if they were documented. It's hard enough to find information about this as it is. I had to do a
Yeah.
bit of digging. But sad story, Zappos died in 1865. So he only got to see that first attempt in 1859. So at least he did see the interest and he saw it starting. The good news, I guess, is that, of course, he had left behind his fortune for funding those future Olympiads that they held. And those other ones, part of the funding was for them to be able to have a stadium. And, the Greek government, they were supposed to be in charge of managing that trust fund and making sure that happened. But they completely ignored it once he was dead. So I don't know what they ended up using that money for, but it didn't go towards the stadium. I'll just say that.
That's so sad.
It is sad, but I guess it kind of establishes the tradition of sometimes money for the Olympics doesn't always get spent the way it's supposed to.
What?
Yeah,
No.
yeah. Let's just say we're not done with that topic coming up.
I feel like we're gonna have a lot of examples in the future
We're
of
gonna
that.
have quite a few, yeah. Now, the 1870 Olympiad, Zappeian Olympiad, I should say, that event was hosted at the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens, which would be used for the 1896 games as well. That's why the money was supposed to go to refurbishing it and fixing it up, but that didn't happen. But at least they did get to use it. So it was in decent enough shape for it to be used in 1870. But Sarah, there's a really cool quote about Zappos that I found, and I think you've got that.
Yeah, Professor David C. Young from the University of Florida. He said, had it not been for Zappos, the Athens Games of 1896 surely would not have taken place. Zappos's actions, his will, and the previous tradition of Zappos Olympic Games had made Crown Prince Constantine of Greece an advocate of the Olympic Games before the formation of the International Olympic Committee in 1894.
Again, I haven't heard anyone else tell this story, and I haven't heard people talk about Zappos and his influence that he had on bringing the games back. So, don't get me wrong, Baron de Coubertin did a lot as well, and he's going to get a lot of time here soon. But before we give him too much credit, I think it's really, really important that we make sure that the Greeks get the primary credit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as a super fan, I mean, I've contemplated naming my pet Pierre after Baron de Coubertin, and I feel, and it's because I'm like, oh, well, I love the Olympics, and without him, we wouldn't have the modern Olympics. And then learning everything about Zappos, it just puts it all in perspective. Maybe I'll have a little dog one day bearing his name.
All right, Sarah, remember we said at the beginning of the show that the idea of the Olympics had never completely gone away?
Yeah.
There were these things called the Wenlock Games, which are actually still going on. But starting in 1850, so we're still in the 1800s with this revival of interest in Grecian culture. Of course, a lot of sports are also taking off. We've got these gentlemen's clubs, as you mentioned earlier. But this really small town called Much Wenlock, it's in northwestern England. They started holding their own version of the Olympic Games semi-annually. The guy behind this was this doctor named Dr. William Penny Brooks, which you don't get a whole lot more British with your name than that. But
so true.
But he was inspired to actually start up the games because of his work as a doctor and as a surgeon. His philosophy behind it was, let's encourage people to be more healthy and to live a healthier lifestyle. And he saw sports as a natural way to do that. So the very first meeting that they had was on the 22nd and the 23rd of October in 1850. Originally, the Wenlock Games were a mixture of athletic competitions and some traditional British country sports. Things like quoit, which I had no idea what that was, so I had to look it up. It's kind of like horseshoes. And then, of course, they had to have cricket. So those were all part of the Wenlock Games. Now, to kind of zoom in a little bit on the athletic competitions, because we don't really do those country sports as part of the modern Olympics, but those athletic competitions included things like running, hurdles, cycling on penny farthings, which that's not a type of coin. That's actually the term for those old-fashioned bicycles, the ones that have the huge front wheel that you've probably seen in old movies or old photos. I would not be against bringing those type of races on bicycles back on top of the other cycling events that we have.
It would certainly be entertaining.
Oh yeah, it would be a ton of fun to watch. They also did what they called, I guess, some really kind of fun events, like maybe what you would see at a field day here in the US, like blindfolded wheelbarrow races. And one year they even had something called an old women's race, where they had a bunch of local British grandmas race against each other, and the prize for winning was a pound of tea. That's not condescending at all.
At all. Oh my goodness. But hey, at least the women are participating, right?
That's right. Yeah. Now you had to be an old woman, apparently, to participate, but it is what it is.
And something that I think is super fascinating that I had no idea about the history of this. So I feel like a failure as a modern Olympics fan, that I was not aware of the history of this. So the event is still to this day organized by the Wenlock Olympian Society. because of that, in the 2012 London Olympic Games, one of the mascots was named Wenlock in honor of the
Hmm.
tradition. So I knew that there was a mascot named Wenlock because I love the Olympic and Paralympic mascots. I never
Yeah.
dug deep enough to know that that's where that came from.
I don't pay nearly as much attention to the mascots as you do. I like them. I like the concept. I just don't memorize their names, but I had no idea it was connected to this town
Mm-hmm.
and their version of the Olympic Games. So,
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Um, in 2017, so we're getting pretty recent,
yeah,
they expanded the list of events to include archery, badminton, fencing, golf, junior biathlon, something called quick cricket. So quick is with a K,
of course.
and quick, yeah. The half marathon, netball, road race, schools hockey, tennis, triathlon, volleyball, and I think this is really cool, live arts such as music, speech, drama, and dance.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's really cool because early on in the modern Olympics, we know that there were art exhibitions,
Hmm.
and that art was a huge part of that. There were people that won Olympic gold medals for art, if I remember correctly. So
Yeah.
um, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it does harken back to the ancient Olympics. We didn't really talk about this in our two episodes about the OG games, but we did talk a little bit about the trumpeting competition and how there
Yes.
was a musical component there. You also had the flute playing during the ancient version of the long jump. But when people would gather together at Olympia, you would have people making speeches, you would have poets reading their poetry. So art was always kind of part of it, and they did try to incorporate it into the modern Olympic movement as well. So you see that happening with the Winlock games. But um yeah, I had never heard about this before, and I have to give a quick shout out to the book Total Olympics by Jeremy Fuchs. That was one of my Christmas presents, actually, and I was impressed because Jeremy, you included the Winlock games in the introduction to the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, someone's actually talking about this story. So yeah, so even though I had done a lot of this research beforehand, it was one of those things where I was like, well, dadgummit, I could have just used this book as my as my research if I had started reading it a little bit earlier. We now have to get to the famous Frenchman himself, old Pierre.
Pierre has entered the chat.
So we're kind of setting the stage now and getting things to this perfect place where when he enters the scene, things are just going to start connecting and falling into place. So enter Baron Pierre de Coubertin. He is known as the father of the modern Olympic Games. His full name was Charles Pierre de Freddy Baron de Coubertin. That is quite a mouthful, so you can see why he probably just went by Pierre. He was born on New Year's Day in 1863 in Paris, France. If you haven't already picked up on this fact because of his name having Baron in it, he was born into a French aristocratic family, and he was the fourth and final child in his family. So he was the baby, and his father, Charles Louis de Freddy, was a staunch French royalist and also a painter, which I kind of like. So again, he grew up in a artistic household. His mother's name was Marie Marcel, and his family, because they had the money to do it, they traveled quite a bit. So that is part of what sparked his interest in history, was the fact that he had this opportunity to travel around and see places that most people could not. Now, Coubertin's life did parallel a massive amount of change in France, from the French defeat in the Franco Prussian War to the establishment of the Third Republic. And Sarah, you kind of mentioned earlier the French
Mm-hmm.
Revolution, right? And of course, the years following the French Revolution were, I mean, just messy, right? So ton of change happening, and he saw all of that happen.
Yeah, and I know you said you don't like musicals, but if you're listening to this and you're not hearing Les Mis in the background, then
Yeah, now
I'm picturing. Do you hear the people sing?
I do like Les Mis. It's one of the musicals that I do actually enjoy. I have seen it on the stage. And of course, Les Miserables is specifically about those years after the French Revolution. And of course, a major plot point is the student revolt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was happening, of course, around this time as well. According to one of my sources, when I was looking deeper into de Coubertin's life, apparently he was a bit of a troublemaker at home. After all, as I already said, he was the baby of the family. So in 1874, his parents enrolled him in a Jesuit school. So I guess they literally had a come to Jesus meeting with him, and it seemed to have worked. He did really well at his school, and it was there that he gained a love for literature and for history, and also for sports.
Yeah, so because he was a member of the aristocracy, because of his family, because of their influence, he was offered a military career, but he decided to pursue law. So he graduated from the Paris Institute of Political Studies, also known as Sciences Po, with a law degree. And it was there that he got the idea of reviving the Olympic Games, and he became inspired to act upon the idea after visiting the ancient Olympic site of Olympia. So pretty cool that he went there and was like, you know what? This is it. I'm doing this thing.
Yeah, I think we talked kind of very, very briefly at the end of our last episode about some of the archaeological stuff that was happening in Olympia around this time. And I believe that's when he visited, was to go see some of those archaeological sites. And I couldn't clearly get a picture of how that overlapped with him getting a law degree, but maybe he was taking a break between semesters. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting. He felt that France's 1871 defeat in the Franco-Prussian War had to do with the lack of physical training for French soldiers. So he felt physical education should be promoted as part of the educational system in France. And I think that's really interesting because what we know about the history of sport, that so many sports were born out of trying to train your countrymen to be ready for war, making sure that they can aim and be fast and be strong. So I think it's really interesting that that was something that he felt convicted of, was that his people were just not in physical shape.
Yeah, I mean, we see this overlap once again of warfare and sports.
Yeah, in 1883, due to his interest in education, he went to England to compare the styles of English education to French, and that helped give him the idea to include sports in the French education program. So, like you said, sports, competition, people like to win. Suddenly, physical education gets really fun for a lot of people. By 1887, he started founding various groups, including a running group. Now, it's not like your neighborhood's running club. These were intellectual societies. I don't know that he was actually running himself, but he was definitely encouraging other people to do it. One might say he was simply running the organization.
Yeah, one might say that. Geez. And that's interesting that, again, we kind of see this thought start to take root of the connection between education and sports, because that was a bit of a revolutionary idea back then. So as he was looking into the English education system and trying to see what they could learn from that, and specifically how sports could play a role in that, that's when he started corresponding with Dr. William Penny Brooks, so our good old friend from the Wenlock Olympic Games. And in 1890, Coubertin actually went and visited the Wenlock Olympian Society so that he could observe the events, how they organized them, how they were held, and discuss further with Dr. Brooks about what a revived international Olympic Games might actually look like. from what I read, it looks like Brooks was apparently very helpful and supportive of that idea of the Olympics being taken to the international level, even though he was, just kind of taking care of his people there regionally. Now, one thing that Coubertin did not seem to like about the English system of sports was their amateur code. And I think we've kind of briefly talked about this before, but in the UK, the amateur code, um, more often than not, it was actually used as a classist barrier to keep lower class individuals out of athletic competitions. So they had this concept that if someone had a physically demanding job, like being a mechanic or being a carpenter or working on a boat dock, something where you had to lift heavy things, their argument was that since your job required you to use your muscles, then you were a professional athlete. So a lot of these, yeah, it's really unfortunate. So these laborers were left out of athletic competitions. I mean, that sounds totally fair and logical, right?
Absolutely not.
I think it's important to note real quick that the Wenlock games themselves were not classist. So when I say that the amateur code in Great Britain was classist, I'm talking about the atmosphere of things at the time in much of Great Britain, but not specifically about the Wenlock games.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Coubertin was he was not a fan of this idea of the amateurs only contest, and he saw how that was excluding people and it was just making sports specifically for the wealthy and the influential. So, to his credit, as a member of the aristocracy, he knew going into reviving the Olympic Games, he wanted his version of the Olympics to change that definition of what it meant to be an amateur and wanting it to be more universal and be more inclusive. Well, at least for men. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I mean, human beings are messy, right? Like, we all have strengths, we all have faults. It can always be hard finding out difficult things about our heroes, right?
Sure. And also being able to understand, like, whether you like it or not, what the norm of society was at that time. That, like, there were still probably many people that were still of the mindset that if you're a female, that you're going to, like, destroy your body if you do any physical activity.
Yeah.
So, even though we know that that's not true and bogus,
Right. Yeah, but
it's the time
was,
period that it was.
Yeah, it was the popular concept at the time. So where Coubertin really started to define what amateur needed to look like for the Olympic Games, really he started getting the idea from America. So we're actually about to enter the picture here. So he really wanted to see how Americans were doing things, and he wanted to test out the idea of amateur athletics in America. I guess that way he could always blame it on us if it didn't work out. I'm fine with that, actually. But he also didn't want his version of the Olympic Games to specifically be a European thing, right? That was really big. He felt like for it to be a truly international event, he needed the Americans involved. So, before we get to America, in November 1892, at a meeting of the Union des Sports Athletiques in Paris, Coubertin proposed the idea of reviving the Olympic Games on an international level. Now, he did that because he was speaking about the virtues of sport and the potential for it to actually promote international peace. Unfortunately, his idea seemed a little too ambitious at that meeting, and he did not get support for reviving the Olympic Games at that meeting. But do you think that stopped old Pierre?
Of course not. He was undeterred. So in 1893, he went to America to check out sporting clubs there and carry on his research. He visited the World's Fair in Chicago during his trip, and he was impressed by the facilities and range of men practicing athletics. By range, I mean their various backgrounds and professions. So he started sharing his vision for a truly international event to encourage athletics and peace. During his trip, he was exposed to collegiate sports, which we know is huge in the United
Yeah.
States. Even back then, it was still, kind of new, but still a big
Yeah.
deal. In the United States, sports had caught on. The YMCA, the real one, not the song, but the song might be stuck in your head, so you're
Yeah, we
welcome.
just don't have enough money to
Um,
play it, and I wouldn't do that anyway. So, anyway, moving on.
yeah. He became familiar with YMCAs, and after that, he knew he needed the US to be involved for his vision of the Olympics as an international sports festival to be complete. But this also clashed with American isolationism at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that was the American policy back then. It's kind of hard to imagine now because I feel like we're involved in every little thing happening around the world, for for better or worse. But as far as the US was concerned, we were very separate from what was happening in the world. There was very little concern about
Mm-hmm.
international politics and what was happening overseas. So, yeah, Coubertin was kind of in this situation where, as I mentioned before, he liked the concept of the amateur code as it was represented in America, that it wasn't classist and that anyone from anywhere could find a sport that they loved and excel in it and participate in it. But how in the world was he going to convince a bunch of Americans to join in what at the time was a European idea, right? I mean, you can't get, those of us in the US, you can't get us to agree about anything. So,
No.
but again, he had a lot of willpower. So after he had at least planted the seeds of the idea in America and gotten some ideas from what the Olympics could look like by incorporating some of the American ideas of athletic clubs, in 1894, at another meeting of the Union des Sports Athletiques there at the Sorbonne in Paris, he brought it up yet again. Guys, let's bring back the Olympic Games. And I mean, he must have been a good talker because just a few years before, everyone shot him down. And yet at this meeting, he got unanimous approval.
Yay!
Yeah. So, with that approval, they founded the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And the group decided, yeah, let's move forward to revive the Olympic Games on an international level. And so they got busy setting up what their amateur codes were going to look like, what the rules for the prizes would be, and they made some decisions on other things that honestly kind of makes you wonder, why was the amateur code so confusing and the prizes so confusing later on. So, theoretically they set up rules for those things, but then practically when they actually had to do it got a bit messy, and we'll get to that. But this meeting was also when he proposed the Olympic motto, Sitius, Altius, Fortius, which means faster, higher, stronger. He did not actually come up with that. It was actually devised by one of his friends, Henri Didon, or Henri. Sorry, he's French. Sorry, Henri, I got your name wrong. Henri Didon. But he brought it up, and that's what they adopted as the Olympic motto. Now, it did recently get changed to faster, higher, stronger, together, but that was a very recent
Mm-hmm.
change for us.
What do you think old Pierre would think about that change?
Actually, I think he would be supportive of it. I
I
think
think so too.
yeah, because that was his concept, right? Was that it was supposed to be something to bring people together. So I think he'd be all for it if he was still with us today. Now, originally, their plan for how to govern the IOC was that the president of the IOC would change every 4 years, depending on the host country. Now, for practical reasons, that's not what ended up happening. But it was a great idea in the beginning. And they said, Coubertin would serve continuously as the secretary of the organization, even though the president would change. Now, of course, today, the host country has their own committee, right? And that's kind of how we've adapted
Mm-hmm.
that. But originally, that was the notion. Now, in the middle of all of this, Pierre did find time for a personal life. I promise it wasn't all about education sports. So, March 12th, 1895, he got married to Marie Rothon, and that gets us up to 1896, where he would bring the Olympic Games into the world. Oh, yeah, also his first child, Jacques. I guess we shouldn't forget about him. So, 1896 was a big year for old Pierre.
Yeah. No kidding. That's a lot to accomplish in a year.
Yeah, father of a human child and father of the modern Olympic Games. There you go. Obviously it's going to get its own episode, so don't write into us, don't yell at us. We're going to talk about Athens 1896 more, but we'll just briefly mention that in that first Olympiad in Athens, 12 nations took part to begin the Olympic movement, centered on this idea of uniting people around sport. So yeah, so that's not where we're ending the episode, but we are going to take a quick little water break, and then we'll be right back to continue Coubertin's story and how that overlapped with the other games throughout his life. So we'll see you in a second.
All right. So we've gotten to 1896 with the first modern Olympic Games. And then after the success of those games, Pierre became the IOC president, replacing Demetrius Michaelis. The first game staged with him there as president was 1900 Paris, which did not go super well, but it was not entirely his fault. We'll talk more about that when we get to the 1900 episode, the 1900 games episode, I should say.
Yeah, it's one of those things where he really cannot be blamed for the mess that was 1900 Paris. We'll talk about this more, but he got cut out of a lot of the planning. And I think that's actually part of why he ended up retaining the title of president, and they ended up changing the plan for changing the presidency, was because he didn't really get that much of a shot in 1900 to actually do what his job was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So he was really disappointed in the 1900 games, and he was hoping that during his lifetime he would get to see Paris redeem itself and that they would be able to host it again. But while that was also happening, he continued his work in education. So he didn't just fully focus on the Olympic Games. He was also doing educational reform. And in 1906, he founded the Association for Teaching Reform. So yeah, not a one-trick pony. He stuck to his ideals of also wanting to influence the education system, especially in France, and see that improved for everybody.
I just want to know, did the guy ever sleep? Because I don't know how he had time to do all these things.
Yeah, I mean, he had to have. I guess the good news is that this was his job, right? As an aristocrat, as a guy who had quite a bit of money and resources for himself, this is what he chose to do every day. So he did get some sleep. He did not attend the 1904 games in St. Louis, which we'll also get into more later on, because they were also quite a mess. In fact, he kind of purposely distanced himself from those games because he was afraid that they were going to be a disaster. There was a lot of American drama happening, and he did not want to get in the middle of that. He actually preferred for Chicago to host the games. You mentioned earlier how he had visited Chicago. But yeah, there was some good old-fashioned American backstabbing going on over here that led to St. Louis hosting the games, and he just did not want to be a part of it. In 1906, originally the games for 1908 were supposed to be in Rome, but in 1906, Italian organizers were way behind schedule with the planning, and then Mount Vesuvius erupted. So the money that the Italian government had raised to support the games in Rome ended up having to go to volcano cleanup. I mean, talk about having things blow up right in their face,
That stinks really, really bad.
Yeah.
And interesting that they were way behind schedule, because that's not a new concept, or, or maybe I shouldn't say that. That would set the tone for future host cities as well.
Yeah.
But that's not a whole lot of time when you think about it, to have to find a new place.
No, not at all. I mean, especially when they were behind schedule and now you've got to find a new host city in less than 2 years. That's pretty crazy.
But he decided to step in, and he helped. And he helped with the decision to move the games to London with only 2 years to prepare. So yeah, in that short amount of time, he was like, don't worry, guys, I'm here. At the 1908 Games, he was inspired by the words of the Bishop of Pennsylvania, Ethelbert Talbot, and he penned the Olympic Creed, which says, "The important thing in life is not the triumph, but the fight. The essential thing is not to have won, but to have fought well." He spoke those words at a reception given by the British government on July 24th, 1908. And I feel like that is a quote that I have seen it on so many things. I've heard it quoted when the Olympics roll around every 2 years. And it's something that I feel like I almost have that quote memorized. It's the Olympic spirit to take part.
It is. It is his most famous quote.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one, even though he didn't completely come up with it, because as you mentioned, he was inspired by the words of this bishop who was, I guess, delivering a sermon. But he did pen the actual words in the order that they're in. So yeah, I mean, it really represents the ideal of the Olympic Games, right? That it's not just about winning, but that it is about the struggle, that it's about having done your best at the end of the day. Sarah, did you know that Coubertin himself was an Olympic champion?
This I did actually know. Imagine the legacy of doing so many things that this gets overlooked. But at the same time, it's not like he was a track and field champion. So tell us about how he became an Olympic champion.
When I found this out, I kind of halfway expected him to win the gold medal for his mustache, because, I mean, he deserved a gold medal for his mustache.
He did.
Was
He absolutely
epic.
did.
Yeah. Have you ever watched the NBC miniseries about the 1896 Olympic Games?
Mm-hmm. I have.
It's not the most historically accurate, presentation of the games. There's a lot of problems with it, but the biggest historical problem is the actor who plays Coubertin has literally no mustache, and it just makes me angry.
Yeah, that's not our guy. It's not our guy.
Yeah, I almost turned the whole thing off when I saw, like, when that actor showed up and I realized he was playing Coubertin. I was like, this is trash. Like, they cast a guy without a mustache. They couldn't even put a fake one on him. I mean, come on.
These are things that we get worked up about.
Absolutely. I'm fuming about it. Anyway, but yeah, Coubertin, I did not know this. So at the 1912 Stockholm Games, this was when they started giving out some artistic awards, like we kind of alluded to earlier. So he actually won the gold medal for his poem, Ode to Sport. I mean, that title alone, right? Just give it the gold.
Absolutely.
Now, here's the thing. Before you think there was favoritism involved in the decision, Pierre was all about fair play, okay? So get this. He entered the poem under a pseudonym. So he used the pseudonym of Georges Heraud and M. Esbach. So not only did he use he actually used two pseudonyms. He entered it as if the poem was written by two people, and the names that he made up are actually based on the names of villages close to his wife's place of birth. So, I mean, what a romantic.
And see, that I did know that he was an Olympic champion for literature.
Yeah.
I didn't know that he entered it in under a pseudonym. I had no idea.
Yeah, because when I first found that out, I was like, well, it's because it was Coubertin, and they were like, oh, let's give the gold to him. But no, he did it. He did it fairly. He did not want people to know that he was the author until the judging was done. So I'm going to read the first stanza of this poem. I am not going to read the whole thing because we have other things we still need to talk about. I might do like a bonus for our sponsors and read the whole thing. But for now, here it is. Here is the opening to the Olympic gold medal winning poem, Ode to Sport.
Let's go.
O sport, delight of the gods, distillation of lift, in the grey dingle of modern existence, restless with barren toil, you suddenly appeared like the shining messenger of vanished ages, those ages when humanity could smile. And to the mountaintops came dawn's first glimmer, and sunbeams dappled the forest's gloomy floor.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. I don't know what a dingle is or a gray dingle. Honestly, that sounds kind of dirty to me. But
Yeah.
there you have it, people. There is the first stanza of Ode to Sport.
Oh, sport, the delight of the gods. So whenever
Yeah.
I'm watching the Olympics, when my husband's like, okay, Sarah, let's turn off the TV, I'm going to be like, nope, this is the delight of the gods. Back off.
It's the delight of the gods, and I need my gray dingles. I gotta have them.
And I say that like my husband doesn't let me just watch it 24/7 when it's on,
yeah.
because he does. So, you
Yeah.
know, he's very supportive, but still anyone who tries to get me to stop, nope, it's the delight of the gods.
It's the
You
delight
heard
of
it
the
from the
gods.
man himself.
Yep, gotta do it. But anyway, I just thought that was a cool fact that he legitimately won a gold medal, even though they don't do the artistic events anymore, and they stopped doing that in 1948. It doesn't matter. At that time, it was an official Olympic event, so it counts.
In addition to his poetry, he also seemed to have a knack for graphic design, because he created the Five Rings logo that we're all familiar with, the Olympic rings, which it first appeared in 1913 at the top of a letter he wrote. He drew and colored them by hand and explained it by saying, "These five rings represent the five parts of the world now won over to Olympism and ready to accept its fertile rivalries. Moreover, the colors thus combined reproduce those of all the nations without exception." So, yeah, those five rings, he just put it on top of a letter and it stuck, I guess.
I think that is so cool because it's a great logo.
It's fantastic.
It like, yeah, now I'm not like a graphic designer myself, but I've known quite a few, and it's one that stands the test of time. Like it still works really well by modern standards of graphic design. So, I mean, way to go, Pierre. That's something.
Yeah, I don't ever see it changing at all.
No. Yeah, not at all. It's too classic at this point. But anyway, we'll move on from praising his artistic pursuits, I guess.
Yeah, so flash forward a couple years. In 1915, the headquarters for the IOC were moved to Lausanne, Switzerland, due to World War I. And we know that that's still where the headquarters are.
Yep.
The 1924 Paris Games rolled around, and so hopefully we get some redemption from the disaster of the 1900 Games, which we did, actually. There was a record number of athletes, journalists, and it was a huge deal. So
yeah,
it was everything that we could have hoped for. And by we, I mean Pierre.
You can say we. I mean,
I'm
a fan of the 24 games,
fan.
even though it was 61 years before I was born. Big fan of those games.
Yeah, that was some quick math. Well done. In 1925, he retired from active IOC duty. However, he was made an honorary president for life. He also founded the Olympic Library with all of his extensive writings and notes, including, I'm sure, plenty of doodles of the Olympic rings. And then he founded the International Sports Education Office in 1928. So here he goes again, just founding all the things all the time. It never takes a break. In
Yeah.
1936, he was a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, but he did not win, which that's sad. So, although he did not win the Nobel Peace Prize, he did win the Virginie Heriot Prize, which was named for a French Olympian yachtswoman. You would think after multiple summers in Paris that some of these names would come more natural to me. All in all, it was an incredibly stressful year for him because it was 1936 and there was a lot going on in 1936. Why don't you tell
Yeah.
us about that?
Yeah. So, okay, we got to put this a little bit into perspective because sometimes I hear people bring this up when they talk about the 36 games as the IOC award the games to Berlin. But we're looking at that retroactively, right? We're looking at that with, you know, hindsight's always 2020. So you have to remember that in 1931, that's when Berlin was
Mm-hmm.
selected as the host city for the 36 games. That was before the Nazis had taken over Germany. In fact, it was really part of why the IOC selected Berlin as the
Mm-hmm.
host for that year is it was kind of supposed to be their, hey, welcome back to the world gift. Like you've recovered from World War One, and the Germans loved the Olympics, which we'll talk about that more in the future. But I mean, they had been involved ever since 1896, so it was a
Mm-hmm.
huge deal that they
Yeah.
were getting awarded. Obviously, none of us can see the future. Okay, like we have to have a little bit of grace and realize that they had no idea that Hitler was going to come to power in 1933, 2 years after Berlin was selected. Um, so yeah, I mean, Hitler when he became chancellor in 33, I mean, the rest is history, literally. In fact, I was just listening to this on, another, I think another podcast, but he didn't really want the games there at first, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get there. But yeah, you kind of have to put that into perspective. But still, he had to be incredibly disheartened by seeing what was happening in Germany leading up to the games. And we have a sense of how he felt about it because he was invited to attend the games and he declined. So he kind of saw the writing on the wall, I think, before a lot of the rest of the world saw what was actually going on. Because back then, people were still like, well, maybe it's not as bad as what we're hearing. Maybe we need to give this Hitler
Mm-hmm.
guy a chance. They didn't know what was going to happen. So yeah, in 1937, he was in a pretty bad state of melancholy. And it
Right.
wasn't just because of the Olympic Games. There were things going on in his family with his kids. There were also financial issues. He kind of saw his life's work falling apart because even though he did have two children, because of some issues that they were facing, they weren't going to be able to continue his work. It wasn't something that was going to be passed on to them. And he had invested his entire fortune into founding all these organizations, into education, into sports. So having I don't know that he would have regretted that or done anything differently, but he had spent so much of his own wealth on doing those things that frankly he was not in the best financial state at the end of his life. So in 1937, he
Mm-hmm.
died on September the 2nd from a heart attack while he was walking in a park in Geneva. Now his body was buried, and well, I should say it still is buried. It hasn't moved anywhere, but it was buried in Lausanne, there in Switzerland. But 7 months after his death, and this was according to his wishes, it was in his will, but his heart was actually buried separately next to the ruins of Olympia. And I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of sweet that his heart was buried in Olympia.
It is very sweet. It came full circle for him from being, the law student
Yeah.
that visited the ancient ruins, and that is where his heart was laid to rest. I think it's sweet.
Now, I'm glad it was spelled out in his will, because otherwise it would be super weird for someone to decide to do that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anyway, yeah, let's talk a little bit as we kind of wrap up the episode about his legacy. Now today, the IOC, they give out the Pierre de Coubertin medal named after him. Now we do need to kind of briefly talk again when speaking of legacy. There is no perfect human being. So, we do kind of need to briefly talk about the fact that, was he sexist? Some people like to point towards his attitude about women in sports because he called women's athletics the most unaesthetic sight human eyes could contemplate.
Oh, if he could see us now.
I feel like it's a little harsh. So,
Yeah.
Sarah, you were talking about earlier how a lot of the concerns back then about women in sports was around like, we're just trying to protect women's health, right? Like there was this idea.
Probably more of an excuse, but some people really did buy into that, right? It was kind of this given that, in a whole side note of history, and I'm sure there's plenty of podcasts that cover this. It's the same way that when women wanted to vote, a lot of times they were deemed insane and would have to undergo certain treatments because they were just so crazy and something was wrong in their brain to think that they should have a voice. And so I think in a similar way, it was such a given that women were just incapable. And obviously we disagree with that. And I only wonder what our buddy Pierre would think of people like Simone Biles today.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, and I'm going to read another quote from him in a second because
and it's also not great.
Yeah, he really did put his cards on the table for how he felt about women in sports specifically, because his reasoning has nothing to do with the reasons that you're giving. It's not because it wasn't because of the biological side of it, and it wasn't because he felt like they were incapable. Like, it was not any of those reasons. So here's another quote.
He was just a jerk.
Yeah, he was kind of a jerk about. So here's another direct quote from Pierre about women in sports. He said, women's sports is impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, there's that word again, and we are not afraid to add, incorrect. Such would be, in our opinion, this female half Olympiad. Because when he said that, he was specifically being asked about, would women be involved in the Olympics? And so he made it very clear that that was not his idea. Obviously, he didn't get his way because women have been involved in the Olympics since the 1900 games. So,
right.
And as you mentioned earlier, he won an award named after a female Olympian.
Right. Well, there's that, and then also thinking about how he was trying to get physical education into schools and whatnot in France. Like, do we know, and this is backtracking, but do we know, did he want that only for little boys, or did he want little girls to be active too?
No, I mean,
all of his efforts in education. So
I think he's made it pretty clear that he was really only thinking about men in the context.
Yeah, but it's okay. I'm a female. For anyone listening, don't worry. I think his remarks are sexist.
Yeah,
like, I don't agree with him.
They are. Yeah.
I am grateful for his work that brought the modern Olympic Games back. Well, that he was part of that. And, both things can be true. He was a sexist jerk. And I'm also grateful for the legacy that he does have, in the sense of we get the Olympics and the Paralympics now.
Right. Yeah, human beings are, again, complicated creatures. None of us are perfect. And so, we have to remember that when we look back at history, that it's okay to recognize that people did good things, but they may have also done terrible things too. So,
Mhm.
but to get us back into a slightly more positive space, one thing I
Yeah.
think that we should mention is honestly, we owe a lot to, in terms of his work of bringing education and sports together and bridging the gap that society had put between the two. When we think about college sports and we think about people getting scholarships and being able to pursue educational dreams and careers, a lot of that is owed to him. He really kind of pioneered that idea of sports being a part of education and being a benefit for schools. And I don't think we would have the the scholarship system that we have today if he hadn't kicked that off when he did. Uh,
It's a really good point.
you could argue that it would have taken a lot longer for someone to bridge those two things together. So
Mhm.
I think we can have a lot of gratitude for that. And again, there are a lot of women who benefit from sports today, that even though that wasn't his intentional legacy, it has worked out as a positive for a lot of people. And then we'll kind of finish, as far as his legacy goes, talking about this fun fact. So outside of the Olympics, I also love space. I love space stuff. And in 1976, a Soviet astronomer by the name of Nikolai Stepanovich Chernik, I mean, that's a very Soviet name. He discovered a minor planet and he decided to name it 2190 Coubertin in honor of Pierre de Coubertin. So yeah, so there's a planet floating out there with his name, and we talked about maybe one day there will be space hockey. Maybe they'll have space hockey on planet Coubertin one day. But that is a wrap on the revival of the Olympic Games. So I know we've already hinted at the first few Olympiads in this episode and some of the things that happened there, but we will dive in more specifically on each one of those in the next episodes. But if you enjoyed this episode,
And we really hope you did.
then we'd love for you to go check out our website, which is gamesodyssey.com. The address is literally in the show notes, in the episode description on whatever app you're listening in. And you know what? Hey, write a review even if you hate the show, just as long as you still give us 5 stars. Joking, but not joking. And then, yeah, Sarah, what else can people do to kind of keep up?
You can also sign up for our newsletter, read a blog, and find links to all of our social media pages. But just in case you want to know what those are now, Instagram, you can find us at Games Odyssey Pod, on Twitter at Games Odyssey Pod, and on Facebook, The Games Odyssey.
Yeah, and again, you can also help the show grow if you don't want to do any of those things, just by talking about it. So through water cooler talk at work, saying things like, "Hey there, water cooler, have you heard about the Games Odyssey podcast?" See how easy that is?
So easy.
Yeah, so easy. Tell that water cooler all about us. But until next time, Odyssey ya later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.